consultancy eftec, and she's the founding director of this consultancy. She specializes in interpreting the economic value evidence for policy and also for decision-making processes. She's a contributing author to the T report. We have already heard this report mentioned various times. And this is a very important initiative drawing attention across the globe about the economic impacts and benefits for biodiversity. She's also a member of the steering committee of the UK Natural Capital Initiative and also a member of the UK Natural Ecosystem Assessment Phase 2. Ece, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm assuming that most of you have either worked with or for economists or hired them, and I'm also assuming that you probably still have mixed feelings about the profession, if not the individual economists. So I hope I won't add to those mixed feelings, but maybe give you some of our perspective. Most of our work at eftec is very much policy relevant. We see ourselves as a sort of a bridge or a translating service between research of all kinds, trying to different experts to get to them to talk to each other, but also getting the experts to talk to policymakers and vice versa. And most of our work, again, is in the grey literature, either funded by government research or private research. Whenever we can find time, we also try and write some academic papers. And we work very much in interdisciplinary settings. Economists, at the end of the day, look like they've got a lot of say in what the decision makers do, but in most of the time, we're used as excuse for something if they don't want to do it or they want to do it, but we don't give them enough evidence. But actually, we can't really work on our own in the environmental policy. You'll see that most of our work, as Lawrence gave the example, it's as good as the science, or as good as an economist's understanding of the science, I should say. So we don't need anything more complex than you're able to give. I think, to partly respond to Bridget's point, it's not necessarily that more evidence is needed, it's necessary that the evidence is reshaped in a way that can feed into economic analysis and policy. So don't feel too bad. I think there's hope. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? I wasn't sure last night whether we chose the two projects to talk about, and whether they were the right projects. But from this morning's plenary, I think it's okay. I think I'll probably spend a bit more time on the first one than the second, but the first one is about how to use value evidence for management decisions for nature conservation, in particular to help the site managers, Natura 2000 site managers, to make decisions about their management. The second one is more about the financing mechanisms beyond public funding, because we're under greater pressure from clients saying, in the public sector, saying we don't have that much more money, you need to find ways to create incentives for private sector to put their hands in their pockets. Although after listening to Professor McGlade, I think there's still some more room to convince public sector for a bit more funding. These two projects also show how the profession in environmental economics has changed. Environmental economists are a bit more like the step brother and sister of the main economics profession that were talked about in the plenary. We're a bit flaky as far as the mainstream economists are concerned, but we're more interested in welfare, we're more interested in what makes people happier. So that's why we're not only about market values, we're not only about financial profit or prices, but we're more about value, what that means I'm not going to go into. It's very difficult still to define. But the profession has changed from, I've been in it for 21 years now, it's changed from what is this economic value? Does the environment have an economic value? What are you doing, economists worried about the environment? what ulterior motives you have sometimes as well. 2, saying, okay, we are convinced now, maybe we are producing an economic value beyond what we sell for price, but can you calculate it for my resource, for my asset? 2, again, which is the final line here, is I want to make more of the asset that I produce. I want to generate more economic value. Can you help me find investment? I think, again, it's much better, as Jackie was saying, to talk about investment rather than funding, or finance rather than funding. I am learning new terms to talk to finance people as well. So in the EU level, going back to the first example that I'm going to give you, in the EU level, the context for that study is the biodiversity strategy, but in particular the Natura 2000 network. I don't have to explain to you what that is, but we were looking at a study. Well, the background to this particular tool is a study that we did with IEP and others on valuing the designation of Natura 2000 network, the benefits of the designation of Natura 2000 network across the EU. And for that, we had to do a qualitative assessment to see what habitats there are, what ecosystem services those habitats are able to provide in the favorable conservation status. And then quantifying those services and then associating some kind of monetary value. These 3 bullet points I put there at the end just to show that, yes, the result is in monetary terms, but a lot of other work goes into that, behind that number. So that study produced a huge number, and for an economist this might be surprising, but this is the only slide I have with a number or a currency on it. Because I'm more interested personally, not so much in the numbers, but in the process that gets us to that numbers. I think that message sometimes gets lost. A lot of our work generates benefits, I believe, for decision makers because we encourage them to think about science, policy, and economics together. I am personally not that interested whether this number is 200 to 300 million or 1,000 million or whatever, because it's probably wrong in any case at the end of the day, for various good reasons, because there's a lot of things are missing from here, but on the positive side, that it does include both market and non-market evidence. It includes marine as well as terrestrial Natura 2000 sites. It also aggregates across all of the network. And it is based on, Lawrence mentioned value transfer. It's based on about 30 studies that covered the type of habitats that were under Natura 2000, and it's aggregated across the whole habitats in the Natura 2000. I said I don't mind it so much, but actually people like Pavan Sukhdev, who's the chair of TEEB, love big numbers because they are the people who are talking to bankers, for example, and the bankers boast about how big the profits they're helping to generate are. So someone like who's going around, someone like Pavan, who's presenting TEEB around the world, wants big numbers because he wants to show, well, you know, nature is not just some nice thing and some ethical concept, but actually we do help you generate your profit and we have extra benefits that you don't have. So these big numbers are important, very, very uncertain, but very big, very important message. But not always enough, because on a day-to-day management of habitats and the environment, these big numbers give you the boost, maybe get you out of the bed every morning because you're doing something good, but they don't help you to make decisions in the margin. So they don't help a site manager for a Natura 2000 or any other land manager actually, deciding what they should do in the next year or 5 years or 10 years in managing their habitats. And there are some very difficult decisions to make. I'm sure even the science is not certain. So we were asked, and this is the link to the project that I'm going to mention, we were asked to create a kind of valuation tool, a value transfer tool for these site managers to use, to make decisions about the sort of where they lie between this blue and orange block. So the green bits are saying that the designation has a value, so that kind of refers to the big number, if you like. So the green and the blue bit that refers to the big number. So there is an environment has a value. Designation protection increases that value because you make sure that the resource survives and improves in quality and quantity. But in fact, if you don't designate, there are some risks. Or if you don't undertake a particular management action because it's too costly, there are some risks. So you will lose some benefits, which is the orange bit. And there are, of course, costs to designate in Natura 2000, not just the costs of management, implementation, investment, which is the pink bit, but also there are opportunity costs that maybe a Natura 2000 manager does not take into account, but a person who decides on designation has to take into account as well, beyond what the Habitat Directive requires. So they are the orange bits. So there are some numbers are needed to make the benefits above the horizontal line comparable to all the costs, because all the costs are in money terms. Most of the decisions, though, once designation is made, is along this line that separates the orange and the blue, the additional benefit of designation or additional benefit of individual management decisions versus not doing them. So these are like decisions that are on the margin. Very hard to quantify. I found from working with technical experts, even what the impact of a particular management decision would be on a habitat or a species, let alone quantify it. But we're trying to help people do it. So this is another way of presenting the slide Lawrence presented on value transfer. I won't go through every box, don't worry, but this is just to show that there is a series of steps to get to a monetary number, and plus there are things that we can't monetize. We need to define the baseline. We need to know to start with in our analysis, and the tool we did takes people through each individual box. We need to know in the baseline what there is, what habitats there are, what assets, if we want to talk about in the natural capital terminology, what assets there are in a Natura 2000 site, applicable across other decision contexts, and what kind of ecosystem services they are producing in the baseline without us doing any further management investment, whatever investment that we're trying to assess. And the second step, what could be those measures? What are the options? What I find working with various decision makers is that usually they skip this thinking a lot in that step. They tend to go into they've got their favorite options, they've got their favorite measures, and they go and trying to justify that rather than use the ecosystem services and economic valuation approach to explore new options that might be more holistic, that might tick more boxes. So if you start with your favorite option, this exercise becomes a bit boring. It becomes a bit like justifying what you want to do. Not you, but one. So on the third step is that we need to look at this qualitative and quantitative assessment. How would the habitats change as a result of my different management options, and how would the ecosystem services change? So this is where the biophysical data comes in. We also then need to think about on the fourth step, who's been affected. I think Kurt showed a much nicer slide about the sort of speech bubbles and questions, like whose benefits and who will pay the cost. And we used to just say population, but the more we work with scientists, we had to start putting human population, because they were saying, well, is it bird population, worms population? It never occurred to me that population would mean something else to somebody else. It's another example of how we need to learn to talk to each other in very simple terms. So we need to see who's benefiting, not necessarily people who make direct use or buy stuff in the market, but also people who have altruistic values, or values for future generations, non-use values, bequest values. And then we need to look at the literature and to see what kind of economic value evidence is there, what kind of studies there are in the past that people have done that are similar to our context. And I'll show a few criteria to judge that. And then we need to just add them all up. I mean, it is really simple. Sometimes it's very complex. We do more scenario analysis if it's a big decision, big context. But in an individual site, for one site manager doing this analysis, it probably ends up being A times B times C. But it gives an idea on aggregating across all ecosystem service changes, across all people affected, using the unit values from the literature. But there are always some non-monetized impacts, whether they are service improvements or service degradation. It's inevitable. It'll never be possible, I don't think, in my opinion, to do a complete economic valuation exercise. And that's all right, as long as we don't forget this box, and as long as we go through this process. We have to do some sensitivity analysis, of course, and we need to report. And the reporting is important because we need to make it accessible to everybody, not just decision makers, but all stakeholders involved. It's very important to realize that economic valuation being a kind of communication tool, a negotiation tool, rather than just a black box exercise. So what we did for this tool is that we tested it in 11 Natura 2000 sites. We designed a draft tool, we sent it to site managers, and we left them alone. I think we fielded a few questions, but they tested it themselves, and then we updated the tool itself. When I say tool, I really just mean a number of tables. There are some tools out there called valuation tools of some sort or another. I won't give names. They're quite black box. They give you one cell that you can fill in, maybe the hectare of habitat and where it is, and they churn out some numbers. Behind those tools also there's a system of what I've just showed, this sort of nine-step approach. That's a pretty standard approach. But the user of those tools don't get to see what's happening. And it's really important that they sit and fill these tables. You know, they speak to their stakeholders and they say, well, what habitat do we have? How much is it? What's the condition? And through filling these boxes like this, they come up with new ideas, new measurement options, new ways to find benefits, arguments, even if they can't monetize them. Just ticking some boxes to say what kind of ecosystem services they're producing. Maybe not even calling them ecosystem services, because the more I talk about it, the more I hear from decision makers that they find this terminology really cumbersome. They don't understand what ecosystem services are. It's kind of second language to us, but not to everybody. And then looking at some studies, thinking about the evidence, reading summaries of economic valuation studies, which we summarize for this tool, and saying, well, what kind of ecosystem services are being studied? Does it match the ecosystem service I'm trying to generate or protect? Where was it? Is it in a place like where I'm managing, or is it some unrelated place? What kind of change did they measure in their study? Is it the kind of change that I am trying to instigate? Who was affected? What kind of people? What number of people? And do they have the same socioeconomic characteristics as the people that I am trying to work for? And whether or not there are any alternatives. We see in the economic literature that whether or not something has alternatives is a very big influence on the value of it. Not surprising, it's the same for everything. But whether I am working on a very unique asset, even locally, versus something that we have thousands of, is a very important factor. So I need to take that into account when I'm trying to find the right evidence from the literature to use. And what are my conclusions? Now, this is a lot of work for a site manager to go through initially, but I think it's inevitable. It's much better for someone to read one article and understand what that value stands for than for them to have 10 different numbers that they don't know what it stands for and they don't know what to do. They just pick the big one or the smallest one, whatever fits their purpose. That shouldn't be our purpose. Our purpose should be to spend more time initially and understand what data we're working with. Results were actually not too bad. People did manage to select some kind of, and correctly select some kind of evidence for most of the services that they were going to be impacting. Majority of those benefits did come from the market value. That does reflect partly what kind of benefits are generated, but also partly where the literature is at. And I have to tell you that there's a declining public funding for valuation studies. They're not that expensive anymore because we've developed methods and we can use online questionnaires, etc. But there's less of an appetite in the likes of DEFRA to give money for valuation studies, and more valuation studies are being funded by utilities like water companies, independent, of course. But understanding value is not enough. We need to find some funding too. And we looked at, in another study, we looked at some funding mechanisms for achieving no net loss or raising money for restoration so that we don't miss the 2020 target as widely off the mark as we did for 2010 Biodiversity Strategy market. I don't think I'm going to go through this study in as detail because the time has gone ahead of us. But we did look at things that will raise some direct funding. So like payments for ecosystem services, more extensive labeling systems like we have for organics or marine stewardship. MCSI. C is just, can't remember now what it stands for. But to help producers that are more environmentally friendly to get a price premium for their product. We also can look at biocarbon, not carbon credits only, but credits that you can buy, carbon offsetting, sequestration perhaps, and also biodiversity credits as well. At eftec, we offset our carbon emissions, not much obviously because we're only 15 plus people, but we try to buy a biocarbon, peatland carbon in the UK, and the smallest credit you can buy is £2,000, which we will buy, but actually we needed much less. So it's a very interesting market that because it's new market, they're trying to sell to big buyers. We're probably not that interested, and then there's small buyers like us who can't buy on their own. But I think we're going to buy and share. So if anybody wants to buy biocarbon, find me afterwards. We then looked at some enabling instruments as well, the old ones like tax relief and getting private financiers interested in investing in environment, earmarking tax funds. Treasury will not even hear that, but you have to revise that kind of instruments, like collecting particular taxes to spend on a particular purpose. And some new ones like that, bonds for green infrastructure. There is a lot of interest in private sectors, definitely increasing interest in my experience as well. They're not that much interested in finding new ways of making money through ecosystem services or nature. They are more interested in reducing future costs and risks, the ones that are interested at all. Most companies still are not interested, but increasing numbers of companies are. And they're also more interested in thinking about their supply chains. So it's not the environment around their factory, but where they buy their raw materials and inputs in places that are more at risk in Asia or Latin America, for example. There's a bit of corporate social responsibility that is getting companies to pay more for nature as well. But that's always a very uncertain area. We did some, and you can see these, I think they'll be online. We did some Swot analysis to see what tools are good for which kind of habitat, and it's going to take too long to go through these reasons for that, but there's a list. And then we also looked at some instruments for no net loss. Again, if you haven't come across these terms will increase in usage on how to get people who cause damage or organizations who cause damage on the environment to compensate that damage. In no way these are licensed to trash as they've been criticized. They are all about compensating the residual damage. It does not give freedom to polluters or users of resources to just pollute and use just because they can pay for compensation. They still have to mitigate and avoid damage, avoid and mitigate before they think about offsets or habitat banks. Anyway, I'm going to say, just to summarize, is that it's clear biodiversity and ecosystem services, whether we think of them together or separately, generate very large economic benefits. We don't even know how large, but we're thinking about change in these services. We're not about valuing absolute value. We just cannot do that. Doesn't mean anything. And management decisions do require very micro, very marginal valuations and impact assessments to be done. Very difficult, but we're not trying to do exact science. This is not academic research. This is trying to get people agree and create consensus and think more creatively. And whatever we do on valuation is not enough. We need to be convincing enough for people to actually invest in protection and improvement of the natural environment. These are my details. In March every year, we run a conference, Applied Environmental Economics Conference for the UK Network for Environmental Economists. If I haven't put you off the profession altogether, this is a good chance to meet about 200 other environmental economists, and we'd be delighted if more of you join us next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ece, and also showing how difficult it is sometimes to get values for ecosystem service in the complex issues we're dealing with. Any burning questions at the moment to Ece?
Interesting talk. Congratulations.
Thank you.
When it comes to, you mentioned the EU Natura 2000 series network. This is all based on terrestrial stuff you can implement. How about marine?
Yep, much less data on marine, much more complex issue. But the research hasn't started that much. Most of the practical research is, the kind of research that we do anyway, is propelled by policy developments. And I think the Marine Strategic Framework Directive has already made and will make significant difference in generating more evidence for marine sciences. Same approach applies, but much more complex and much less data available.
And when it comes to designations,
yeah,
it's a patchwork without connectivity. We designate an area here and there, no connectivity. Whatever happens between affects both.
Absolutely.
Terrestrial and certainly marine. We draw arbitrary lines along marine areas. There needs to be a holistic, integrated approach, not this network of, you know what I'm saying?
Wherever it's easy to designate. Yes, but I have to make it clear that it's not designation is not an economic decision. It's entirely based on science. We provide the economic evidence to show in the impact assessments, for example, in the UK.
But science is very often compromised by policy and politics.
I know, tell me about it.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you.
Well, theoretically, at least, designation of the sites is scientifically based, not on ecosystems, but on the, because there are certain habitats, certain species present in those areas. So I think your approach should be applicable more, should apply more to the general biodiversity policy of the EU and not only to the Natura 2000 network. I don't see any direct link between your approach and the Natura 2000 network. Because the Natura 2000 network is there already.
Yes, but it's definitely applied generally, wherever. But the problem with the Natura 2000 network is that designation is not enough. That the money is spent on management to keep the designation or to improve it. There are lots of designated Natura 2000 sites that are actually in very poor condition. So this work was not about that should we designate or should we not designate. It was about once designated, how can we make an argument for more money to be spent on to make sure that the quality of the Natura 2000 network is increased. So the same management, even after designation, the same management trade-offs do apply. And designations could be lost. No, not at all. This is just an example that I gave. Yes, sorry, to clarify. This work goes on everywhere. This work goes on at the national level. In fact, in the summary, I meant to say, do watch out. DEFRA in the UK had 3 studies coming out. One is woodlands and marine environment satellite accounts that will have as much monetary evidence as possible. So this approach will be used there. They also got a corporate natural capital accounting study coming up. And because they want to work with a few pilot companies to develop the corporate natural accounts, not separate environmental accounts. And they've also got a study on payments for ecosystem services, beneficiaries, what needs to happen for more organizations to become buyers in PES schemes. So these are 3 things that we put proposals in last week, so wish me luck. So it is used at that national level. It's also used that in lots of other management decisions for locally designated areas or not designated areas where farmers want to make a choice, for example. They're doing these things anyway, not necessarily following my colorful slides. But, and also in Wales, there's a study ongoing which we're involved with colleagues at Cascade Consulting on, again, looking at options for payments for ecosystem services and lots of other instruments to see how the Environment Bill and Sustainability Bill can be implemented in Wales. So this was just an example. Yeah.
Okay, Ece, thank you for your presentation. I see some more hands, but we still have a half an hour after this plenary session to sit at the different corners in this room to discuss some of the work with the presenters. Ece will sit at this table, Kurt will sit at that table, and Lawrence sit at a table in the back where you can ask more in detail questions and discussions about the work that has just been presented. I just would like to sum up some keyword and challenges I think we got from these presentations, but not only from these presentations, I hear them at many meetings where I'm going to, and we already had it this morning also in Jacqueline's presentation, that there is a need for integration of the science, but also integrations of, we just heard a question about Natura 2000 networks we have. We need to integrate across natural science, social science and economy. And maybe this ecosystem service approach provides a framework of doing this much better than we did in the past. And maybe this gives also a better framework to communicate what we as scientists develop to the policymakers, and vice versa, for the policymakers to feed back to us what they actually need and see everything in a holistic approach. So communication is certainly remains a challenge, but it's not a one-way challenge. It's not only from the scientists to the policymakers, but also from the policymakers to the scientists, advising us what indicators they would need to make proper policy decisions, and we need to tell them what we can provide to them. And then finally, very important is also to have stakeholder involvement in this whole process, and also the general public. And the more we get the general public and the stakeholders on board, the more we may be able to progress in a more sustainable development of our nature. Because sometimes if the policymakers don't understand the concept, if we can communicate it to the general public, they can put them pressure on that way to the policymakers in the future. But we need to engage them and make them understand the work we are doing in simple terms. So I hope you enjoyed this session. I certainly did. I would like to thank again all the 3 speakers and wish you a very fruitful meeting in the afternoon further on with some more fruitful discussion. Thank you very much for attending this meeting.